Um, I've cut quite a bit out of this paper, so if you'd like to receive the long version, send me an email and I can email you as an attachment. I want to start with a quote from the UN from their landmark 2006 report on violence. Naming forms and manifestations of violence against women is an important step towards recognising and addressing them. The widespread and entrenched nature of violence against women in Papua New Guinea is often remarked. Generally, discussions of this problem are restricted to one type of abuse, physical violence. I'll just start again. So I started with a quote which goes, naming forms and manifestations of violence against women is an important step towards recognising and addressing them. The widespread and entrenched nature of violence against women in Papua New Guinea is often remarked upon. Generally, discussions of this problem are restricted to one type of abuse, physical violence. This narrow focus is perhaps understandable given the visible trauma and injuries that accompany physical violence. However, this impoverished understanding of violence means that other non-physical forms of abuse that women face at the hands of their partners are overlooked. This paper focuses on one of the diverse dimensions of violence that many women suffer at the hands of their partners, economic violence, aiming to contribute to a deeper and more nuanced understanding of violence which will enable practitioners to more accurately develop, quote, interventions and tailor existing programs to unique experiences and needs of women. Although there is an increasing recognition that economic violence against women has received far less attention than other forms of violence, there remains a dearth of empirical insight into this phenomenon. This is mainly because violence has often been perceived as physical violence. As Outlaw argues, quote, the vast majority of empirical work is still focused almost exclusively on physical violence. The literature examining economic violence is growing, but this is mainly confined to developed high-income countries to the neglect of developing low-income countries, including those in the Pacific. This paper seeks to increase knowledge about economic violence, taking the specific case of rural Papua New Guinea. While connections often exist between physical and economic violence, it is important to examine the latter in its own right, since it is another serious harm that many women suffer. The international evidence shows that economic violence can stifle women's entrepreneurial activities and prevent them from achieving economic independence. Economic violence can cause women to be pushed further into poverty due to their partners seizing a large share of women's earnings, or preventing them from earning an income which can make it impossible for women to leave violent partners. It can also undermine women's access to education and development opportunities if their partners seek to control their movements and activities. Economic violence can threaten women's economic security by eroding their capacity to save and to secure the savings they do achieve, which undermines their ability to withstand unforeseen adverse circumstances. This paper draws on research undertaken as part of the project Do No Harm, understanding the relationship between women's economic empowerment and violence against women in Melanesia. The research was done in April 2016 in the Papua New Guinea Highlands provinces of Jamaica and Chimbu, where 91 interviews with women were completed. These comprised in-depth qualitative interviews which sought to explore marital relationships, how the domestic economy is managed within the family, and what causes conflicts in a relationship. Semi-structured interviews with key informants were also undertaken to gather contextual information, particularly the cultural, economic and social factors affecting women's income generating activities, as well as gender relations more broadly. The great majority of women interviewed earn money through the informal economy, the selling of garden produce or cooked food at markets. A few earned income by selling livestock, and some in Jamaica earned money by selling coffee beans. A few women received some income from elementary school teaching or filling roles in churches or as a women's representative on the local level government council. Overall, the women interviewed valued the opportunity to earn an income and spoke positively about its benefits. But income generation is not without negative impacts, including the extra burden of work it entails, the difficulty of finding someone to care for children, and the problems of accessing markets. A major challenge women confronted was economic violence, which saw their efforts to bring income into the household either eroded or erased altogether. The burgeoning literature on economic violence sees economic violence or abuse as including a range of behaviours which impact negatively on women. Adams and colleagues define economic abuse as behaviours that, quote, control a woman's ability to acquire, use and maintain economic resources, thus threatening her economic security and potential for self-sufficiency, end of quote. In a study of Lebanon, Uster and colleagues say that economic abuse entails, quote, the withholding of earnings, restricted involvement in the labour force and limiting purchasing decisions, end of quote. Adding to these aspects, Farwell writes that economic violence includes, quote, acts such as refusing to contribute financially, denial of food and basic needs, preventing women from commencing or finishing education, or from attaining informal or formal employment, and controlling access to healthcare and agricultural resources. In their scale of economic abuse, Adams and colleagues distinguish between two broad types of economic abuse: economic control and economic exploitation. The former focuses on the types of behaviour which aim to control women's ability to obtain, use and make decisions about economic resources. The latter focuses on types of behaviour that involve the husband taking the wife's income and or withholding or restricting the funds they give to the household. While the scale of economic abuse is wide-ranging and satisfactorily encompasses many forms of economic violence, it is far more applicable to developed countries than developing countries. In developed countries, women have higher levels of employment, much greater access to financial services and more assets. Factors such as low workforce participation, high levels of financial exclusion and lack of assets means that a wide range of economic abuse related to employment, banking and property that occurs in developed countries is simply not applicable to the vast majority of women interviewed during this research and by extrapolation to the women of rural Papua New Guinea. For example, in Papua New Guinea, women's formal workforce participation is relatively low, and the vast majority earn income through informal means, such as the sale of commodities at markets. Women are also likely to be financially excluded, for as a recent Women's World Banking study concluded, quote, Papua New Guinea is a challenging place for women to start and grow businesses and to access financial services. Recent research among coffee smallholders found that women's financial exclusion was most pronounced in relation to individual bank accounts, with only 6.6% having their own account, whereas 35.2% of men had their own account. Women have less assets than men, especially the essential productive asset land, because the land tenure system imposes constraints on their ownership of land and their access to it. The Highlands region is dominated by patrilineal land tenure systems, which position men as landowners and render women essentially landless. Having no access to land, an essential requirement for the production of livelihoods and income, is a major impediment to women's ability to earn income independently. While a woman may have some use rights to her father's land, upon marriage she is expected to move to her husband's land and then to use his land. Marriage does confer some rights to a woman to use her husband's land, but women are at a disadvantage when it comes to accessing land which they control and from which they can independently secure the economic benefits of production. Their lack of land places women in a relatively powerless position, and it makes it difficult for them to escape violent and dysfunctional marriages. The research in Jawaika and Chimbu found that women are subject to several forms of economic violence. Below, I make use of Adams and colleagues' two broad types of economic abuse: economic control and economic exploitation, since this captures the range of economic violence women experience. Sometimes these two broad types are woven together so that women are subjected to both economic control and economic exploitation. Sometimes women are subjected to one broad category, either economic control or economic exploitation, but not to the other. So in some cases, a woman has economic control over her earnings, but is nevertheless subject to economic exploitation because her spouse refuses to contribute financially to the household. Economic control, control of spending and financial decision making. The research have identified two main ways that financial decision making takes place in Jawaika and Chimbu. One, household income management, where the husband and wife contribute their earnings to a common pool. And two, independent income management, where the husband and wife manage their own earnings separately, but whether they both contribute to the household expenses or take responsibility for particular household expenses varies. Sometimes households use a combination of both, so that the husband and wife may pool some money, but each partner retains control over significant resources that they manage separately. Household income management is a feature of domestic relationships in Chimbu, but less so in Jawaika. In cases where money is pooled, husbands often seek to control wives' spending and to monopolise financial decision-making. And several women we interviewed indicated that their spouses made all the decisions about the use of pooled money. Indeed, in some cases it appeared to be more akin to the husband seizing the wife's income. Thus, economic control includes the alienation of women from decision-making about the use of money, including their own earnings. This lack of power and control over earnings is indicative of a lack of power and control over other aspects of women's lives. Some husbands demand that their wives seek permission for any expenditure of pooled income, though when it comes to their own expenditure, they simply proceed without consultation or agreement. This was the case with one woman in Jawaika who reported that although the family's main source of income came from her sales of garden produce, she must ask her husband's permission to spend money to the benefit of her family. When her husband earns money, he does not consult with her about its use, though in this case she said he does spend it for the benefit of the family. A respondent from Chimbu reported that her husband is the main decision maker in the household, and if she tries to participate, he tells her she must submit to him. He also tells her to listen to him so that their marriage will be strong. And though she used to argue with him, she no longer does so. He is also in control of income each fortnight and prepares a budget, telling her what to buy, and if she does not follow his demands, he slaps her. Despite this, she keeps the money she earns from her harvest separately and spends it as she wishes, which suggests that violence and power within relationships can sometimes be manifested in contradictory ways. Another respondent from Chimbu reported that her husband makes all the household decisions, which she accepts as a man's role. She believed that a husband should hold the household money and decide how it is spent. However, occasionally she spends money without her husband's permission, and he responds by getting angry. However, he has been known to spend all of their money on beer and cigarettes, and if she questions him about this, he responds with anger, though in this case not physical violence. In some cases, husbands take control of household income even when they do not themselves contribute to it financially. One respondent, whose violent husband, who has no income and only occasionally contributes labour towards earning income, takes control of the income she earns. She says that her husband looks after her well, spends their money on the family and sometimes helps her with the garden and selling produce, but he also beats her if she is not fully submissive, does not do all the work he requires of her, both in the garden and in the home, or if she does not make a profit at market. The husband makes all the decisions with his wife only occasionally contributing to them. If she earns money at the market, she must take it straight home and hand it over to her husband. Some income is held in joint savings account to which they both have independent access, though. She is expected to ask permission for any expenditure, whether this is to spend cash immediately after it is earned or entails withdrawing money from their joint bank account. However, both husband and wife do spend money without consulting each other, which leads to conflict. If the wife fails to consult her husband about her spending, he responds by beating her, though he does not usually consult her about spending for his own benefit. Preventing women from income generation. Economic violence that involves controlling women's income, barring them from earning or making it unnecessarily difficult for them to earn an income, heightens women's dependency on men, making it even more difficult for them to leave the relationship if they wanted to. Generally in Papua New Guinea, the gender division of labour means that women are expected not only to do the agricultural labour that provides food for the family, but also the domestic and caring labour in the household. If income generation interferes with women's domestic responsibilities, this may lead to emotional and physical violence from their husbands, who seek to keep their wives submissive and obedient. During field work, we heard some examples of men seeking to control or prevent women's income generation, particularly if it prevented a wife from performing her gender-defined duties, such as domestic chores, but also because many men are extremely jealous and wish to control their wives' movements for fear of extramarital relations on her part. However, many men welcome their wife earning money since it allows them to opt out of contributing financially to the household. One example, a respondent from Jamaica, told us that although she has control over her income and decides how it is spent, her husband endeavours to control her movements, not allowing her to walk with others and sometimes forbidding her from going to the market where she earns money. Other women are subject to controlling behaviours from their spouses, who give detailed daily instructions to their wives as to how they should use their time, disrupting their efforts at income generation. One woman reported that if the time she spent at the market earning money left her with insufficient time to do all domestic and child-raising tasks in what her husband regarded as a timely manner, he would become verbally aggressive towards her and argue with me for not preparing food for the kids early. This appeared to be a common problem, several women commenting on the risk of physical violence for women whose income generation requires them to market. If husbands consider they are away from home too much or they return home late, they become physically and emotionally violent because they consider their wives to be neglecting their domestic duties. Putting women under pressure to fulfill gender norms has the effect of making income generation a risky enterprise with costs that include physical violence. Economic exploitation, demanding, seizing money. The most common form of economic exploitation women endure is demands for money. Husbands routinely pressure and bully their wives for their earnings or savings so that they can use the money for their own discretionary spending on alcohol, marijuana, gambling or other women. Sometimes the demands for money come in the guise of asking for loans, which are not repaid. While men usually harass their wives for money, this sometimes takes the form of seizing the money or stealing it from their wives. This harassment often includes physical violence or threats of it. Several women reported that when their husband was drunk, he would subject her to aggressive bullying and physical violence, especially if he had spent all his money on alcohol and wanted to buy more. A key informant described the common situation of men demanding money when drunk. Quote, "They are mad. They go and beat their wives with a stick, demanding they give them money or any of the small earnings that they have made from marketing. Men expect their wives will give them money so that they can go around, drink beer and play cards. The woman will think about the family and looking after the children. She will budget for the children, but the man comes and puts pressure and demands that she give him the money." End of quote. In one case, a respondent reported that when her husband came home drunk, he would demand money and break things and steal her money if she refused to accede to his demands. One woman from Jamaica reported that even though she is no longer married to him, her former spouse still comes to her regularly and demands money, threatening her with violence if she refuses. He also plundered several of her gardens which were ready for harvesting, taking the food for himself and his new wife. When she was still married to him, he would demand money from her after she had earned it at market, beating her if she had refused. Husbands who contribute no income to the household still demand money from their partners. Some husbands expect full control of all the income his spouse generates, even when having not contributed to earning it. This is especially common in the context of cash crops, such as coffee, that bring in larger amounts than is usually gained from market vending. Income from cash crops is often appropriated by husbands, even though their spouse was the major contributor of the labour to its production. This applies especially to Jamaica, where coffee is an important source of income. Key informants noted that despite women doing all the labour to produce the coffee, many men seize the coffee when it is ready for sale so that they can, as one remarked, see the money first. One key informant described the resulting inequity in sharing coffee income. I won't sorry, wrong one. I won't read this, it's rather lengthy. Men justify their seizure of coffee income by recourse to arguments about land and the fact that the coffee trees are planted on land that is owned by men. This leads men to see coffee as men's business. Women have more control over income they earn from selling garden crops, but this is generally because men believe that selling vegetables brings in little money compared to coffee. Although income from vegetables is seen as belonging to women, this does not prevent some husbands demanding money from their wives when they've depleted their own resources. Even though many men may consider that the income from vegetables belongs to women, they are nevertheless keen to know what their spouse has earned. One man suggested that a man will do a, quote, stock take when his wife returns from the market in an effort to ascertain whether there is money he can demand or seize. Men's refusal to contribute to the household. Economic violence is not just a question of women keeping control of the income they have earned themselves and preventing it from being seized by their spouse, for it is also a question of husbands contributing financial resources to the household. Indeed, a byproduct of women's income generation is that it enables men to reduce their financial contributions to the household or to opt out completely. That is, they deny wives access to their income or allow only limited access. This is largely because many men view the money they earn solely as their own to use in whatever way they wish. This was confirmed by key informants who said that men refusing to give money to their wives is very common, regardless of whether their income comes from wage labour or from selling garden produce or other cash crops. The result is that the women of Chimbu and Jawaika often bear full responsibility for the financial support of the household, even when their spouse does have an income. By default, women become the sole breadwinner of the household, something that sees them overburdened with work. Men in paid employment also do not share their income with their wives. According to one key informant, lots of working men don't use their money properly. They spend the money on beer. It's a big issue. A few men spend their money wisely, but most men spend their money on alcohol. Some men are okay. They share their money, but lots of women who come here to Voice for Change, an NGO, the husbands don't share the money equally with them, especially the men like teachers or those working in mining companies. In some cases, where men had an income, they considered that they should only contribute half or less to the household, though they nevertheless expected their spouse to contribute all of her income. Some men refuse to tell their wives how much they earn, some do not tell the truth about their income, and some refuse to contribute any money to the household. For example, a woman from Chimbu reported that her spouse lied about his earnings and what he spent his money on. A woman from Jawaika reported that she didn't know how her husband spent his wages when she tried complaining about it, but eventually resigned herself to not knowing. Sometimes he would give her money for the household, but would tell her how she had to spend it. Some men do not contribute financially to the household because they do not earn an income, preferring to live off their spouse's earnings. One woman from Chimbu reported that her husband used to work as a security guard, but no longer does, preferring to live off her earnings and beating her if she does not give him money, which he spends on other women. He nevertheless makes all the household decisions. Another woman from Chimbu reported a similar situation. Although her husband had an unspecified source of income, he would not share his money with his wife and generally wasted his money on his own discretionary spending while expecting his wife to provide his daily needs. Indeed, the reason some women started income-generating activities initially was due to their husband's failure to provide financially for the household. Scholars have noted that in developed countries, husbands sometimes intentionally deplete their spouse's resources in order to limit her options. Adams and colleagues write that women in, quote, abusive relationships also have a difficult time maintaining their economic resources when their partners engage in behaviours that generate costs. For example, stealing, damaging or destroying their spouse's possessions and household items. Women are often expected to be selfless, to ignore their needs and to put the needs of the family before their own. Jury and colleagues report that they have recorded, quote, countless instances in which women's male partners have disregarded their needs or the needs of the children in favour of indulging their own financial wants and needs, irrespective of the health and social implications of such spending discrepancies, end of quote. Further, they add that this privileging of, quote, stereotypically masculine purchases, such as alcohol, cars, gambling, operates to reinforce the devaluing of women's activities and needs. An implication of this is that women are precluded from active participation in the social life of the community, since they are forced to spend almost all of their time maintaining the household, which further reinforces the belief that a woman's place is in the home. We heard no evidence of husbands of the women interviewed for the research consciously engaged in such strategies to deplete their wives' resources and social participation. It is probable that they simply see their own wishes as superior to their wives, but nevertheless their behaviour is likely to have the effect of reinforcing the view that women belong in the home doing inconsequential work that is beneath notice. Some husbands minimise or withdraw financial support to the household, and others withhold labour, refusing to take up paid employment or to carry out subsistence labour, relying solely on their spouse's efforts. So while some men contribute nothing or almost nothing to the household, their wives work hard to feed the family and to bring in income to meet household expenses. A recurring refrain from our respondents was the imbalance in workloads and the lack of support from their spouses, especially in the often heavy labour in the garden. Economic violence causes significant harm, not only to women but also to any children or other dependents in the household. Life is quite precarious for the women interviewed in Jawaika and Chimbu, who are dependent on selling commodities at market and whose profits are usually very small. Economic violence causes financial hardship for the family, making a precarious existence even more precarious. Moreover, when husbands demand or seize income, this prevents women from income generation or refuse to contribute funds to the labour to the household. Women are less likely to be able to develop independent financial resources, to accumulate savings or acquire other assets. Being asset poor makes it difficult to leave dysfunctional and violent relationships, and also it makes it difficult to provide for economic and other shocks. A shortage of assets means no funds are available for expenses such as health and education. Women must forgo treatment for themselves or their children because there is no funds for user fees, medicines or transport to health facilities, and children's education is curtailed. While physical violence and economic violence are distinct forms of violence, the nexus between the two is strong. It is important to recognise that economic violence is one part of a repertoire of violent behaviour which uses various forms of violence with the aim of achieving power and control in intimate relationships. Thus, economic violence is also sometimes accompanied by threats of or actual physical harm by male spouses. Physical violence can be used to enforce economic violence and can provide a coercive strategy to force wives to hand over income. As some of the examples above show, spousal conflicts over money and income generation often degenerate into physical violence because women resist handing over their hard-earned income to their spouses. This is not to suggest that women are at fault or that responsibility for physical violence lies with them, but simply to point out that one of the triggers for physical violence can have economic violence at its heart. This has led some scholars to argue that economic violence comprises a risk factor for physical violence. Given that women are usually responsible for maintaining the household, it is not surprising that they are grieved about and often contest their husband's demands for money or his failure to contribute to the household. Several of our respondents reported that their husband became physically violent if they refused to give him money. Similarly, women's contestation of their spouse's failure to contribute to the household or his wasteful personal expenditure can produce a violent response. Some respondents reported that even a simple request to their spouse to contribute to the household was enough to provoke physical violence. For example, one woman from Chimbu told us her husband responded to her request for money to support their children by beating her. Another woman from Chimbu reported that her husband beats her when he believes she is not doing enough work in the garden or tending the pigs properly, both of which are income-earning activities. The husband of another woman mentioned earlier beats her when she returns from the market if he deems she has not earned enough money or is withholding some of the earnings. She reported that the only way to avoid being beaten on a return from market is to bring all the money home and show it to him. Her husband holds and controls the money she earns and decides how it is spent, and she must ask his permission for any expenditure. Occasionally he has prevented her from going to market and the produce that was ready for sale was wasted. He also responds violently if she questions his unnecessary expenditure. Conclusion. This paper recognises that economic violence, which is often overlooked, is one manifestation of violence in a spectrum of violent behaviours. The data from our Papua New Guinea research shows that economic violence is all too common and can take a variety of forms. The research was not specifically designed to examine women's experience of economic abuse, but focused more broadly on the relationship between women's economic empowerment and violence. Had the research focused more exactly on economic violence, the data gathered might have revealed more varieties of economic violence than discussed here. Nevertheless, the data clearly shows that many women in the provinces studied, and by implication more widely in Papua New Guinea, endure this form of violence. Some different examples of economic violence in the literature are concerned with men creating economic dependency in women when they seek to control their wives by restricting their employment or interrupting their work, so that they remain economically dependent on their husbands. This may also entail the husband restricting resources to his spouse. Jury and colleagues describe how in New Zealand the, quote, stripping of economic power is represented for many women a simple and inescapable method of securing dependence upon their abuser. In such cases, husband withheld money for household essentials, and this comprised a source of humiliation and shame for the victims. In the Highlands of Papua New Guinea, the behaviour of husbands is more concerned with maintaining power and control over wives than with creating dependency. This is partly due to the rigid gender hierarchy in which men value their own status and welfare more highly than women's. It is also due to marriage practices, in particular to the exchange of bride price, which is often considered to give men absolute control over their wives to justify domineering behaviour and physical and other forms of violence. Men use the expression full price, full body, meaning that since the full bride price requested was paid, the husband has complete control of the wife's body. Bride price, men say, entitles them to control over their wives from, quote, their feet to the hair on the head, or from head to toe. Though the forms of economic violence evident in the Highlands of Papua New Guinea are not about creating dependency as in the New Zealand case study, Jury and colleagues also argue that the men they studied were at base similarly motivated by the desire for power over women. Economic abuse, they say, quote, appears to be exercised primarily to gain and exercise control and domination over women, end of quote. Much as the quotation at the start of this paper puts it, quote, a problem recognition is the first step towards finding a solution. It is therefore important to name violence in all its forms. More research is needed on economic violence, both in itself and in its intertwinement with other forms of violence against women. Thank you.